You get a better cam and stuff like that for over YouTube. Hmm. Gonna have to figure that out. All right. So this morning, I read the first few chapters. I'm up to chapter 6 of this particular book. And so I'm going to be going over chapter 6 and then a little bit further. If you want to see the live that we did earlier today, you can find that over in YouTube. That's in the link tree. And I'm also streaming over there, although the video quality isn't as good because I'm using something different. And by the way, this is my cat, one of my 3 lovely cats, and he likes to cuddle while I'm doing this. So if you see the cat, that's because the cat likes to cuddle. He's my lucky cat. He was found in the engine of a car after it had gone 20 miles down the road. Anyway, so let's get into this. This particular book is educational. TikTok, this is an educational book reading, as is okay by the community guidelines. This particular book will discuss immunizations and how to discuss these topics in a meaningful, respectable way. Just a second here. Anytime I talk about this subject, they throttle my my network for some odd reason. Not sure why. Give it a second here. There we go. All right, let's dig into it. This is now chapter 6. It's vaccine pioneers. Some of the words in the book for moderation will be altered a little bit. So if you hear me pause for a second and try to reword things, it's because the wording isn't acceptable by TikTok guidelines. But this is an educational reading and for educational purposes. 6, vaccine pioneers. Contemporaneous with the first anti-vax movements, the first steps toward the fields of microbiology and bacteriology were taken. Louis Pasteur developed the first theory of microorganisms as playing a role in metabolic processes, and in 1858 published these results. He discovered that microorganisms were the cause of spoilage in food and drink that were heating. Pasteurization could be used to prevent transmissions of disease infected milk. Joseph Lister became aware of this work and began experimenting with the use of solutions of phenol to prevent the spread of gangrene in wounds and developed methods of chemically sterilizing surgical instruments that greatly reduced the rate of infection. These discoveries helped the germ theory of disease displace other ideas about the causes of disease, such as miasma theory. Under the germ theory, many diseases, are caused by microorganisms. The development of sterilization and the realization that microorganisms were responsible for causing many diseases also led to improvements in the ways that vaccines were transmitted, stored, and administered. In 1850, glycerol had been used as a means of storing vaccine matter, called lymph, for longer periods of time while remaining effective, but the discovery was not widely disseminated or used until later in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, it was discovered that this effect also reduced the bacterial count within the lymph, thus making it safer and less likely to produce unintended infections in patients. Another innovation was the inoculation of cow flanks to produce vaccine lymph, because this method was less likely to transmit infections from human host to human host than collecting lymph from humans. Refrigeration allowed for longer-term storage of the lymph. In the 1950s, means of freeze-drying virus mixed with a protein called peptone were developed. This allowed a much longer-term storage at ambient temperatures without degradation. Over time, several alternative methods of producing vaccine material were discovered, other than incubation on cow skin, such as incubation in eggs and in cell grown in dishes. Interestingly, the virus we now have that is used to produce smallpox vaccine, vaccinia, is an unknown origin. Vaccinia is related to, but not identical with, the cowpox virus. has been yeah has been transmitted through replication in laboratories over many generations and may be more closely related to horsepox, which was also used in the 19th century for vaccination. During the late 19th century, Pasteur was also very active in investigating the nature of microbial life. At the end, the prevailing theory of the origins of life was spontaneous generation. Under this view, certain conditions were naturally appropriate for life to arise, and it would appear that with those appropriate conditions arose. For example, spoiled meat was thought to be naturally generate flies, and broth was thought to naturally generate bacteria when left unattended. In 1862, Pasteur showed that by preventing microorganisms from gaining entry into boiled broth, it would not become cloudy with growth. Later, Pasteur developed the second effective vaccine in history, which protected against anthrax. He had early shown that anthrax had caused bacteremia. By isolating and then using chemicals to attenuate or reduce the infectivity of anthrax, he was able to develop an immunization that provides immunity to anthrax and was significantly reduced the chance of infection. In 1885, he had the first successful human test of a vaccine he had developed against rabies, again using the method of attenuation. Attenuation of vaccines by various means continues to be used in various forms to this day. At the end of the Victorian era, sporadic outbreaks of smallpox still occurred. In 1885, Montreal became the subject of one such outbreak. A much smaller epidemic had been occurring between 1876 and 1880, but civil authorities did little. The virus was brought to Montreal by an infected person on a rail car, and Boston had a minor outbreak from the same rail car, but acted swiftly to vaccinate. So only 6 people in the city were infected. The civil authorities in Montreal were unprepared and slow at obtaining the vaccine. When the news came out that the vaccination was to be made mandatory, anti-vaccination rhetoric had been so effective that a mob of several thousand people congregated and took possession of the streets. The group wrecked the health office and threw stones through the windows of the physicians and the city health officer. Order was eventually restored, but the skirmish erupted with Canadian cavalry, which only ended when they were ordered to load up their pew-pews. Although this was the last major outbreak of smallpox in a city developed world, it would be nearly another century before smallpox was wiped out completely. The citizens of Montreal bought into the anti-immunization rhetoric, and in doing so left themselves open to infection. While other cities had occasional occurrences of smallpox, the vaccination was high enough to prevent an epidemic. The very fact that smallpox outbreaks became remarkable in itself is remarkable. There's a particular figure that they're showing here. Shows the incidence of smallpox in London between 1629 and 1902 as a percentage of unalivings. Before the discovery of immunization, smallpox was responsible for little under 10% of unalivings in London, dropping to less than 5% by the 1850s, with the exception of the pandemic in 1870. It is difficult to estimate the number of lives saved by technology such as smallpox vaccination. Even a few decades before its eradication, 10 to 15 million people were newly infected, and 1.5 to 2 million people passed away annually, especially in the developing world. An estimated 300 million people died of smallpox in the 20th century alone. As if the entire 2019 population of New York City passed away 35 times. In addition to the lives saved, by the elimination of smallpox, there was also an end to the suffering, disfigurement, and blindness of those who would otherwise have been harmed by it. If you lined up all the people who would have lived since 1980 because the smallpox was eliminated and took 1 minute to reach all of them, you would spend the next 144 years meeting the people who did not pass away of smallpox. And that ends chapter 6 of this particular book. And for those who are commenting, I am going to say flat out, if you want to learn, you can sit and listen to the book reading. I encourage you to continue reading with me, like listening to me read the book, and to learn from it. I think that some of the things that you are worried about and that you're talking about in the comment section will actually be addressed in the book as we move along with it. So instead of yelling, about it, I encourage you to come along with me and listen to it. Yes, absolutely. That's what this is. It's a book reading. That's what this live is. It's a book reading. Okay. So we're going to continue on here. And TikTok, this is for educational purposes. This is a book reading of educational nature, therefore okay under community guidelines. 7. The 20th century anti-vaccine movement. In the early 20th century, there was a lull in anti-vaccine activity. The legal parameters of vaccination became settled at the end of the 19th century by amendment in Britain and the Supreme Court case in the United States. These laws allowed objectors to opt out, but not necessarily to participate in public schools if unvaccinated. Anti-vaccine activists and public health officials had reached an uneasy solution. Despite this, the anti-immunization views of previous decades were still influential. In 1921, Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement and prolific writer, published a guide to health outlining his views on disease. Gandhi wrote that he believed that smallpox is not a contagious disease, but rather is caused by the blood getting impure, owning some disorder of the bowels, and poison that accumulates in the system is expelled in the form of smallpox. The man didn't know everything, so that's pretty interesting that he thought that way. We know that to not be true. On vaccination, he wrote, "Vaccination is a barbarous practice and is one of the most unaliving of the delusion current in our time, not to be found even amongst the so-called, um, wild races of the world." I really had to redo that for the mods. Its supporters and not content with adoption by those who have no objection to it, but seek to impose it in the aid of penal law and rigorous punishment on all people alike. And I cannot help feeling that it is a violation that dictates religion and morality. So, I mean, when you look at how some people viewed it back in the day, even Gandhi, it's quite interesting. He had a lot of strong words about it. You should read about Gandhi. He wasn't perfect, not by any means. He outlined 5 arguments that he had against it. That preparation of immunization involved the suffering of innocent cows, that immunization would spread disease other than smallpox, and that smallpox immunization would not guarantee immunity, and the vaccines were filthy, and the disease would not be cured by that filth. However, by 1930, Gandhi may have changed his mind, at least partially, after a smallpox outbreak in which he saw several children pass away and their parents did not have them immunized. In deference to Gandhi's views, he reported it to have said, "I can't sleep. These kitties are fading away like little buds. I feel the weight of their deaths on my shoulder. I prevailed upon their parents not to get them immunized. Now the children are passing away. It may be, I am afraid, the results of my ignorance and obstinacy. And so I feel very unhappy." And though himself did not believe in it, he would not stand in the way of the parents who wanted to have their children immunized. From Gandhi's perspective, these views made some sense. Immunization was a treatment being imposed by a oppressive government he opposed. The imposition took away the bodily autonomy of the people he was fighting for. It must have seemed just like another way to control people in the most intimate possible way. The British Raj imposed immunization without making an effort to understand the cultural context to which it was being introduced and the way that the practice would be viewed. In the early 20th century, polio was reaching its peak as a recurring scourge. Parents were fearful of allowing children to play outside in the summer, aware of how polio was transmitted as being seen as the debilitating effects. Polio could produce paralysis and unaliving. In the 1930s, 2 teams that worked to develop immunizations with disastrous results. John Colmer of Temple University had developed an immunization through attenuation of live polio virus by passage of rhesus maquis. Colmer's vaccine was tested in 10,000 children. Jeremiah Milbank and Maurice Bodie worked on another version of the immunization, this one using a virus that had been inactivated by formaldehyde. This vaccine was also tested in thousands of children in the same year. Brody's immunization didn't produce evidence of effectiveness, but it did produce allergic reactions. Between the 2 immunizations, 6 children unalived and 10 were paralyzed. Following these tragic deaths, justified public outrage had been argued to have set back the search by a cure by 2 decades. The anti-vaccinist movement exaggerated the degree of human experimentation being done and framed the experiments as the testing of immunizations on orphans. Though Colmer had sought parents' permission and Brodie had tested the immunization on himself. 15 years later, a series of polio epidemics made the need for an immunization very clear. A new race began to develop the first widespread safe polio immunization, and two approaches were used. Jonas Salk used a virus grown in culture and then unalived with formalin. Another form of polio immunization under development by Albert Sabin used attenuated virus. This virus was grown in non-human cultured cells under conditions that introduced mutations. After a number of passages, the mutated virus was less effective at infecting human cells, but was similar enough to wild strains to still produce immunity in humans. Salk's immunization was developed first in 1952 and within a few years became one of the most widely tested biologics in history, with more than 600,000 participants. The March of Dimes led a mass immunization campaign, and the incidence of polio in the United States dropped from 35,000 cases in 1953, then fewer than 6,000 4 years later. In 1955, Sabin first presented promising results for his attenuated polio immunization. Each vaccine type had both advantages and disadvantages. The inactivated vaccine was long-lasting and required additional injections to provide long-term protection. The live attenuated vaccine could only be taken orally and thus protect the throat, one of the main entryways of polio into the body. However, the live attenuated vaccine carried a small risk of causing cases of vaccine-derived polio. With the oral vaccine, the attenuated virus reproduces in the gastrointestinal tract and then sheds in feces. Whereas in poor sanitary conditions with populations that have poor vaccine coverage, it can spread to others. Under these conditions, the live virus can mutate and become more virulent as it spreads. After billions of immunizations with oral polio immunization, a handful of such outbreaks occurred. And in 2016, the oral immunization was modified to make this complication less likely. And these outbreaks would have stopped by immunization of the surrounding population with more oral polio vaccines. While Salk's vaccine became predominant in the former United States, Sabin's attenuated virus vaccine had been used to vaccinate far more people worldwide. One of the reasons that Sabin's invention is more commonly used worldwide than Salk's invention is that Sabin's can actually, it's cheaper to produce and it can get to places that need it a lot more readily. So if you want to get it to like poor areas across seas or whatnot, you want to have it in a format that you can easily carry to these remote locations. And Sabin's Sugar Cube, as some people call it, was the way to do that. So when we talk about Sabin's invention being more widely used, it was the accessibility thing for people that were in poor rural communities that made it that way, especially because even though Salk's invention was safer and more effective over time and stuff like that, it did require multiple doses, had to be stored a certain way, and was a little bit harder to get to these very rural communities. So that's a little bit of background on that, okay? In April 1955, one of the worst pharmaceutical accidents in modern history began to unfold as it became clear that more than 100,000 doses of polio immunization produced by Cutter and Wyeth Laboratories had been improperly inactivated and so resulted in 250 cases of paralytic polio and 11 unalivings. The reports of paralysis only in the limb that had been injected suggested strongly that the immunization caused this. These incidents shook the public trust in the new polio vaccine and led to the development of a permanent committee to test a lot of polio vaccines before they're released to the public. The aftermath of the Cutter and Wyeth incident was continued to influence vaccine policy and opposition to the present day. This is weird. Some of the writing in this is wonky. Some parents began to believe that the vaccination was inherently unsafe. Some medical professionals even refused to participate in the polio program due to perceived risk of contamination. The British Medical Research Council halted the trials of Salk's vaccine, and a number of European countries stopped planned immunization programs. However, the Cutter and Wythe incident was also much stricter oversight and testing of vaccine manufacturing. Even if anti-vaccine activists today are unaware of the incident, they're likely to have been influenced by the events that followed it. In 1974, the scientists, Kluenkampf, Schwartzman, and Wilson published Neurological Complications of Pertussis Inoculation. This paper alleged that the combination of Tdap had caused encephalopathy in 36 children, including symptoms as convulsions, spasms, screaming, vomiting, unconsciousness, or infection anywhere from 0 to 2 weeks after 4 DTaP injection of booster. These patients were selected because of the severity of alleged symptoms and a belief by the scientists that the symptoms related to the inoculation. The finding of the paper would later turn out not to be true, as sometimes happens in the scientific literature, but once published, the authors could no longer control how the paper was used. Small clinical reports of this sort are common, and the advice given in this report to look for complications following DPT inoculation was modest and even reasonable. The public reaction that followed, however, was large and revived the immunization fears that had lingered following the Cutter and Wythe incident. The paper came out at a time that disability politics were changing and a number of policies were being enacted with the goal of improving the lives of the disabled. In 1973, the Association of Parents of Vaccine Injured Children, APVDC, was founded by Rosemary Fox and Renee Lennon, mothers who blamed their children's damage on polio immunizations and wanted to form a society of children injured by immunization, so from a position of strength they can put pressure on the government for compensation. And once again, TikTok, this is for educational purposes. I'm just reading from a book. In March of that year, an anonymous letter had been published in the British Medical Journal, proposing that Britain adopt a compensation scheme similar to those of the European nations, where anyone with a disability caused by immunization could seek money from the government. The letter provided justification in the form of an ethical argument that if there is a small risk to the individual posed and immunizations benefit society as a whole, then the government should compensate those rare individuals who are unlucky and harmed. Effectively, this is the same argument that underlies the vaccine court in the United States, VIC. Armed with moral government argument and modeling tactics based on successful disability advocacy groups, the APVDC sought legislation that would bring compensation from the government, and the 1974 paper seemed to support their mission. So to the APVDC, the paper took an outsized importance. They decided to focus on the DPT immunization to create doubt surrounding immunizations that were able to point to the paper as evidence, the one that was debunked. Their campaign was effective in convincing parents not to immunize. By 1977, immunization rates had dropped by 50%, and an outbreak of disease seemed likely. Eventually, the government capitulated? Ew, I got the word. Hoping to mollify the APVDC and allay public fears by setting up a compensation program. The result was the Vaccine Damage Payments Act of 1979. Despite the success, the APVDC took much of the blame for the 1979 pertussis epidemic that followed. Starting in 1979 and continuing into early 1980s, an outbreak of pertussis occurred. Following this outbreak, immunization rates recovered and even surpassed pre-1974 levels, surging roughly 95%. However, the effects of the campaign and the 1974 paper was felt worldwide. In the 1982 Vaccine Roulette, a television report produced by the Washington, D.C.-based NBC affiliate WRCT aired. The 30-minute program was spent 11 minutes showing the images of disabled children and less than 2 minutes on a girl with whooping cough. The program prompted thousands of worried parents to call physicians and officials. In 1986, the book DBT, A Shot in the Dark, argued that pertussis immunization was dangerous. Despite public concerns these raised, immunization rates remained high in the United States, as they did in Poland, Hungary, and the former East Germany. Anyone who was in here when I was reading the first couple of chapters, they did make mention that a lot of people, despite worries, may immunize in other countries. Because they may have concerns, but they do so anyhow. In Sweden, DBT immunization rates dropped from 90% in 1974 to 12% in 1979, and pertussis outbreaks followed in 1983 and 85. Between 81 and 83, 4% of patients hospitalized for pertussis developed neurologic complications. 14% of those developed pneumonia, and 3 children passed away. In Japan, a movement arose against pertussis immunizations, and the Ministry of Health and Welfare eliminated the whole cell pertussis immunization. Rates of vaccination fell from 80% in 1974 to 10% in 1976. Here again, an outbreak followed, resulting in 41 unalivings before a new immunization was introduced. In the Russian Federation, several pediatricians led a campaign against pertussis vaccination, which led in turn to a drop of confidence in epidemics. In Ireland, immunization dropped from 30% in 1976. An epidemic occurred in 1985 and 89. In Australia, the same story, a drop in confidence followed by medical professionals seeking recommendation, followed by an outbreak of pertussis. A pattern emerged from the way these countries had reacted to suggestive link between pertussis immunization and neurologic disorders. In countries where anti-immunization rhetoric had taken hold, but the public health officials maintained strong disease surveillance, took measures to reassure the public, and maintained strong immunization programs, pertussis did not return. In countries where doubts took hold and the public health officials capitulated by moving away from pertussis vaccination, the rates dropped and the outbreaks occurred. The outbreaks ceased once immunization resumed. This conclusion is compatible with research showing that motivations of government and officials differ when it comes to immunization decisions. Governments are primarily concerned with the cost, whereas individuals are primarily concerned with the perceived risks. Collectively, immunization protects non-immunized individuals through herd immunity as well. Absent collective motivations, individuals should choose immunization at lower rates. In the United States, the DPT scare resulted in a series of lawsuits filed against 3 manufacturers of the DPT immunization. Wyeth Laboratories stopped manufacturing the vaccine because of their low profitability and their risk of litigation. By 1984, Connaught Laboratories, the second of the 3 major manufacturers of the vaccine, had halted production, citing the risk of lawsuits. These stoppers led a shortage of pertussis vaccine. The number of lawsuits filed related to DPT immunization went from 2 suits in 1978 to more than 250 suits in 86. The later seeking a total of $3.162 billion. Several large payouts were awarded and several payments were reached, but a doubt had created lawyers swarmed, demanding larger payouts for the claimants and themselves. A shortage created these legal actions, put DBT vaccination rate at risk of dropping, and the public health officials became concerned that a major outbreak might occur. The National Childhood of Injury Act, the NCVIA of 1986, was the U.S. Congress's response to this risk to vaccine availability. The act's intent was to both create a system of monitoring possible unknown restrictions and reactions from immunizations, and all patients who met certain criteria to receive compensation without threatening the supply of immunizations necessary to maintain public health. The act recognized that the private manufacture of immunizations were necessary for the public, required legal protections when their manufacturing and proper corporations lose interest. One of the notable outcomes of the act was the establishment of the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the VICP, in 1988 to compensate those children that were injured routinely during immunization. Although the concerns about DBT vaccine turned out to be unfounded, occasionally the adverse reactions do not occur with some vaccines. The VICP provides a list of such reactions, and patients who experience these events within a specified time frame may ask for compensation. The program now compensates medical and legal costs, provides up to about $250,000 for pain and suffering, offers a death benefit of $250,000. Legal fees may be covered, even if a claim is not accepted. Occasionally, the existence of immunization court or compensation those who get through the VICP is used by anti-vax activists to suggest the broad recognition that immunizations are in fact genuinely dangerous. However, legal standards of evidence are not the same as scientific standards of evidence. Legal judgments don't determine scientific truth. The trials or scientific research does. The VICP will compensate based on preponderance of evidence, the term that means that the person evaluating the evidence for the claims believes there are more than 50% probability that the proposition is true. So that's a pretty interesting thing. That being said, I am getting tired. I don't know why. Usually I'm not so tired, but I am tired. So what I'm going to do is I bookmarked it for y'all, and I will continue on when I get time later on. Here's the thing that I also will impose onto some of the people in the comments. When I am reading an educational book to you, when I am sharing a bit of education with you, okay? And sometimes you'll hear me stop and explain things every once in a blue moon, things like that. I am teaching you something. You are more than welcome to stick around and get that education, or you don't have to. That is completely up to you. It is your story. But it's more important that if you're going to come into a live, instead of yelling and screeching through the comments, to actually listen to me read the book. Because you're like, oh, poison, I'm actually reading to you why that's not true. But if you would sit and listen to the book, these anti-vax movements, they don't want you listening to me read this book. They don't want you to hear about the scientific history of this. They don't want you to understand it. And I'm here saying I'm reading a book that breaks it down nicely for people, that explains those concerns that people have in a way that is non-judgmental and in a way that is easier to understand. When you just yell in the comments, you're not listening, you're not learning. And I believe that it is important for people to learn something new. So I encourage you to come back when we have our next live. I'm going to continue on with that. It's just like, I'm so tired, my eyes are crossing. So that's why I got to stop right now. I hope I got time tomorrow. I'll sit down and I'll continue on with the chapter. And we'll go through that. Oh, I got to get them cut down. Jaco's coming. They're color changing. I just haven't been able to get out and do that because my son has been sick. I can't drop him off at daycare, and I don't have time like before or after work because it's a 12-hour day and stuff like that. Everything's closed by the time I get out. They need to be trimmed down to meet regulation. They're just at that line. 1/4 of an inch, by the way, is regulation for nails. So, fun fact. All right, we will see you a little later, okay? I need to get some sleep. Time to get some sleep.